Hello, and welcome to Lesson 14, the second lecture on Islam. After a quick introduction and a general overview to the four great stages, we are going to begin our discussion regarding the five great pillars of Islam. And the five pillars of Islam really encapsulate the foundational philosophy for the rest of the chapter, and really the foundational philosophy on how one should orient their lives. And therefore, the rest of the chapter, which discusses social teachings and economics, really stem from these five pillars. And after the discussion of economics goes into the divisions that occur within Islam, highlighting specifically Sufism, and then ends with a general overview of Islam. But for our purposes, it's really important to understand that the first part of this lecture that goes over the five pillars sets the tone for the rest of the chapter, and therefore the rest of this lecture. And again, what I mean by that is that the rest of the chapter's contents and conclusions are going to stem from these initial theories. And now, keeping that in the back of our mind, we are going to move on to the next slide, which is an introduction to the four great stages and what is considered the straight path. This section starts off by stating that if Muslims were asked to summarize the way Islam counsels people, the answer might be that it teaches them to walk the straight path. In the name of Allah the Merciful, the Compassionate, praise be to Allah, Creator of the worlds, the Merciful, the Compassionate, the Ruler of the Day of Judgment. Thee do we worship, and Thee do we ask for aid. Guide us in the straight path, the path of those on whom Thou hast poured forth Thy grace, not the path of those who have incurred Thy wrath and gone astray. So there's this concept here of the straight path. Now, one obvious interpretation is that one walking a straight path means one should not be crooked or corrupt. So the road that is crooked or varies side to side has a way of waning when things get difficult. This is the first and most obvious interpretation. But Huston Smith states what's distinct to Islam, however, is the second way that you can understand this meaning. As the straight path is one that is straightforward, it is direct and explicit, which means there's not a lot of theorizing going on here. There's an actual road on what one ought to do and how one accomplishes living the good life. Thus, Islam is known for this direct approach, and Islam spells out the way of life it proposes. As Huston Smith states, pinpoints it, nailing it down through clear injunctions. Every major type of action is classified on a sliding scale, from forbidden through indifferent to obligatory, not leaving room for interpretation, but rather providing a recipe one can follow. They claim this as one of their religious strengths. For God's revelations to humankind has proceeded through four great stages, through four great prophets. The first stage came from Abraham, where God revealed the truth of monotheism, God's oneness. The second, God revealed the 10 Commandments through Moses. Third, God revealed the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto us. This was revealed through Jesus. And then the fourth one, God revealed instructions through Muhammad in the Quran, which answers that very important question, how should we love our neighbor? How do we go about enacting the ideologies of Jesus? And the answer to this question is that the Quran provides them. The glory of Islam consists in having embodied the beautiful sentiments of Jesus in definite laws. That is why it's considered the straight path. Now, the straight path is actually broken up into this section into two parts. The first part discusses the 5 pillars of Islam, the principles that regulate the private life of Muslims in their dealings with God, and then they discuss the Quran's social teachings. Although, as I stated in the introduction, much of the social teachings of the Quran can be seen as stemming from at least one of the 5 pillars. So let us begin our discussion by moving towards the first pillar. The first pillar of Islam is a creed, or a confession of faith known as the Shahada. This creed is summed up in a single sentence: there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. A very straight and to the point creed, but its affirmation is deep. Take the first part of the creed, for example. There is no God but God. This is an announcement of a monotheistic principle. There is no God but the God. And Arabic for the God is Allah. So there is no God but Allah. In addition to the monotheism, there is no God but the God, states very plainly that there is no other divine but God, which we discussed in the last lecture is very distinct to Islam, in that there is no other godly substance than God. This moves us to the second part of the creed, and Muhammad is his prophet. This affirmation, to quote Huston Smith, registers the Muslim faith in the authenticity of Muhammad and in the validity of the book he transmitted. So this second part of the creed affirms that what was transmitted from Muhammad is valid. So these principles are kind of the undertone of what goes along with this creed. But what it means to the Muslim people is a lot more powerful. As Huston Smith states, this creed is the ultimate answer to all questions, can be used in every type of crisis. Huston Smith gives many examples of how this creed is used. But philosophically, it's important for us to understand the foundational belief and principles that are being communicated here. This leads us to the second pillar of Islam. The second pillar of Islam is the canonical prayer, in which the Quran adjures the faithful to be constant. In its pragmatic sense, the prayer keeps their lives in perspective. That is to say that the Muslim prayers have a practical way of keeping one's life in perspective, quoted by Huston Smith as being the most difficult lesson. For as creatures who neither crafted ourselves nor the world, we can't seem to get it straight that we are not the center of things, and we live as though we are laws unto ourselves. That's where the ego and the selfishness comes from, that creates havoc. So while the prayer is meant to keep our ideas or our heads attuned to a certain perspective, the purpose of the prayer is actually in response to life's natural impulse to give thanks for its existence. Thanking our Creator for our being. Now, the perspective that this places upon us is one of objectivity. We can see the whole picture as it is, as opposed to seeing the world in our own subjective egos or within the lens of our own subjective egos. And in practice, this comes down to submitting one's will to God's as its rightful sovereign, which should be familiar to you because that's where Islam gets its name from. As discussed in the last lecture, the meaning of Islam is a surrender to Allah. So now that we know the purpose and the underlying principles associated with the prayers, Huston Smith goes on to tell a story about how often the Muslims believe they should pray. Now, I won't go into the full story, just summarize really the ending part, as Muhammad went back and forth between Moses and the Lord, bargaining on how many times the Muslims should pray. Moses was of the mind that the number was still too high. But at this time, after going back and forth, it comes down to the point where Muhammad refuses Moses' plea to make things lighter, as Muhammad believes his people can handle this load. As he states, "I have asked my Lord till I am ashamed, but now I am satisfied and I submit. The number remains fixed to 5. So that means the Muslim people are required to pray 5 times a day. They are to pray when the sun rises, when it reaches its zenith, its mid-decline, at sunset, and then before retiring. They are all to pray in the direction of Mecca, giving kind of unity that no matter where you are in the world, there is a unifying practice of praying towards Mecca, praying in the same direction. And the standard themes of these prayers are praise, gratitude, and supplication, with the overall purpose, as described earlier, to submit one's will to God in order to keep our lives within a certain kind of objective perspective. And with that, we can move on to the third pillar. Now, the third pillar of Islam is charity. Basically, what should be done about the disparity between the haves and the have-nots? And the answer here is those that have much should help lift the burden of those who are less fortunate. So while this is a concept that was embraced by our democracy in the 20th century to produce the concept of the welfare state, the Quran introduced this basic principle in the 7th century by prescribing a graduated tax on the haves to relieve the circumstances of the have-nots. They accomplished this by not only taxing income, but taxing holdings as well, annually distributing amongst the poor 1/40th of the value of all of their possessions. The priority here being those in immediate need, slaves in process of buying their freedom, debtors unable to meet obligations, and strangers and wayfarers. But the underlying principle here is that it is the responsibility of those who have a lot to help lift the burden of those who are poor. The fourth pillar of Islam brings us to the observance of Ramadan. And Ramadan is Islam's holy month in the Islamic calendar. It is the month where Muhammad received his initial revelation, and then 10 years later was the same month where Muhammad made his historic hijrah migration from Mecca to Medina. Now, on a side note, as Islam uses a lunar calendar, Ramadan rotates around the year. So in order to commemorate these occasions, those who are not ill or involved in a crisis must fast for the entire duration of Ramadan. And what this means is, from the first moment of dawn to the setting of the sun, neither food nor drink nor smoke passes through their lips. Only after sundown may one partake in food, drink, and smoke, but must be done in moderation. And as you can imagine, because of the lunar calendar, sometimes Ramadan falls on winter when its demands aren't too excessive. But in summer, the long days without so much of a drip of water can be quite the ordeal. The purpose of this, however, reaches back to our earlier discussions on the purpose of fasting. Fasting has a way of opening up one's mind, enhancing their ability to think. It also has a way of teaching self-discipline. That is to say that one who can endure the demands of Ramadan will have less difficulty in controlling the demands of appetites at other times. This kind of fasting also has a way of underscoring the creature's dependence on God, putting into perspective our own human frailty, which, as you can imagine, promotes the idea that we found in the second pillar of Islam, putting one's life in perspective. A perspective that makes clear our dependence upon God. And last but not least, fasting sensitizes compassion. People who have fasted for 29 days within the year will be apt to listen more carefully when next approached by someone who is hungry. So this kind of fasting also promotes the third pillar of charity. The hope being that once you've fasted and feel what it's like to starve and need food, you are much more open to the idea of charity in order to ease that kind of burden that is placed upon someone year round. But going back to the intellectual or clarity of mind that fasting produces, we can kind of understand this because when we are hungry or thirsty, it is much more difficult for us to study. It is also very difficult for us to concentrate. And this is not only the case for bodily appetites, but for emotion as well. For how often is it stated that when a person is extremely angry, they make an irrational or emotional charged decision? It is therefore through fasting that we gain the ability to control our emotions and control our appetites, freeing our mind's ability to think rationally. By fasting, we lax the tethers from our bodies to our minds by targeting our compulsions and our desires. This leads to the fifth and final pillar of Islam, the pilgrimage. And through this fifth pillar, it is stated that at least once during his or her lifetime, every Muslim who is physically and economically in a position to do so is expected to journey to Mecca. And the purpose of this journey is to heighten the pilgrim's devotion to God and his revealed will. Now, what is interesting about this fifth pillar, and is highlighted by Huston Smith, is the practical benefits of this practice. The first being a reminder of human equality, because upon reaching Mecca, the pilgrims remove their normal attire, which carries the mark of social status, and dons two simple sheet-like garments. We all understand that what a person wears has a way of reflecting their social status, or at the very least, their tier level within a certain social hierarchy. So part of the pilgrimage is to remove those marks, thus removing that distinction of rank and hierarchy. It also provides a useful service in international relations, because it brings people together from various countries, demonstrating that they share a loyalty that transcends loyalty to their nations and ethnic groups. This pilgrimage brings people together who may only have in common the fact that they believe in the teachings of Islam. Overall, these 5 pillars consist of things Muslims need to do in order to keep the house of Islam erect. There are things they should not do, however, that are more universal. They should not gamble. They should not steal. They should not lie. They shouldn't eat pork, drink intoxicants, or be sexually promiscuous. That is not to say that no Muslim does any of these things. But as Huston Smith states, even Muslims who transgress these rulings acknowledge their acts as transgressions. Now, most of these so far, with the exception of charity, has pertained to the Muslim's personal life. So now we're going to move on from that personal life to the social teachings of Islam. O men, listen to my words and take them to heart. Know ye that every Muslim is a brother to every other Muslim, and that you are now one brotherhood. Words that were spoken by the Prophet during his farewell pilgrimage to Mecca, shortly before his death. So right from the start, the social teachings that are highlighted here are ones of unity. To quote Bernard Lewis, "There is something in the religious culture of Islam which inspired, even in the humblest peasant or peddler, a dignity and a courtesy towards others never exceeded and rarely equaled in other civilizations." And it is with this understanding that the section turns to the moral climate before Muhammad and the moral advancement after Muhammad. So before Muhammad, there was virtually no restraint on intertribal violence. There were also glaring inequalities in wealth and possession that were basically accepted as the natural order of things. Women were also regarded more as possessions than as human beings. Also, men could marry an unlimited number of wives. Thus, the relations with women were so casual that beyond the first wife or two, they scarcely approximated marriage at all. Also, infanticide was common, especially with girls. Yet within a half a century, there was effected a remarkable change in the moral climate on all of these counts. What accomplished this? Something this book has already alluded to. A feature of Islam that Muslims will say is precisely that of Jesus and the other prophets: brotherly and sisterly love. But what Islam promotes here is not just an ideal, but a detailed prescription it sets forth for achieving this brotherly and sisterly love. A kind of systematizing that, as Houston Smith states, Jesus would have probably enacted had he had more time to do so. But as it was left unfinished, was reserved for another teacher to systematize the laws of morality. For the Muslim people, the Quran is this later teacher. For in addition to being a spiritual guide, it is a legal compendium. That is to say, in addition to being a spiritual guide, it is concise and detailed in the subject of law. A network that is so intertwined that Westerners who define religion in terms of personal experience would never be understood by Muslims, whose religion calls them to establish a specific kind of social order. For Islam joins faith to politics and religion to society inseparably. Thus, we now turn to the 4 areas of collective life, the first of which is economics. So this section on economics starts with a first principle, that Islam is acutely aware of the physical foundations of life. Basically, that until bodily needs are met, higher concerns cannot flower. Which means that each of us requires that our foundational or physiological needs be met in order for higher cognizant concerns to flourish. If people's basic needs of food, water, and shelter aren't met, it is unlikely that society as a whole will progress. The section goes deeper into this understanding by using a specific metaphor, inciting that just as health of an organism requires that nourishment be fed to its every segment, so too a society's health requires that material goods be widely and appropriately distributed. This should bring your attention to the third pillar of Islam, which was concerned with charity, as these are the basic principles of Islamic economics, and nowhere do Islam's democratic impulses speak with greater force and clarity. Thus, the Quran, supplemented by the Hadith being traditions based on what Muhammad did or said on his own initiative, set forth measures that broke the barriers of economic caste and enormously reduced the injustices of special interest groups. The overall model that animates Muslim economics is the body's circulatory system. Much like Plato believed in his book, The Republic, that the model for society is synonymous to the model or harmony within a well-ordered soul, so do the Muslims believe that economics can be modeled after the body's circulatory system. Just as your overall health requires that blood flow freely without clots, so too can society flow justly as long as clots are extinguished and its overall health maintained. As Huston Smith states, honoring the analogy, laws are in place to ensure that wealth is in vigorous circulation. Islam does not object to profit motive or economic competition or entrepreneurial ventures. It simply insists that acquisitiveness and competition be balanced by the fair play that keeps arteries open and by compassion that is strong enough to pump life-giving blood or material resources into the circulatory system's smallest capillaries. So, according to the metaphor, the blood is that material aspect of economics. Wealth, food, water, shelter, and things of that nature, which needs to circulate throughout the body and cannot be situated in distinct areas of the body, because that will form clots. So, to prevent this kind of clotting, the Quran went after what it saw was the severest economic curse of the day, primogeniture, and outlawed it. And primogeniture is the idea that all wealth that is inherited should go to the firstborn sibling. And in the case of the Muslims, the firstborn son. Thus, the Quran went after this and saw that the inheritance should be shared by all heirs, daughters as well as sons. Another economic avenue, in order to promote fairness, prohibited the taking of interest. Loans were once used to tide the unfortunate over in times of disaster, but now was being used importantly as venture capital. Unfortunately, this venture capital benefits the borrower more than the lender, because the lender is excluded from the enterprise. Thus, to accommodate the change in times, where it was more for venture capital and less to tide over during disaster, a change was made by making the lenders in some way partners in the venture for which their monies were used. Now, all of a sudden, the lender was tied into the venture and could benefit from its gain. Our take from this, however, is to acknowledge how the third pillar of Islam that concerns itself with charity works into this economic ideology of wealth distribution, and how that correlates to the model of the circulatory system. One example that should jump right out is the aspect of monies. And just as blood needs to be distributed throughout the body, promoted by an active flow, money needs to be distributed throughout society, all while making sure clotting does not occur. And the clotting is represented by the economic materials converging in one place within society. Now, with that understanding on how the Quran improved economics, we can move on to another area within the collective life that was improved, the status of women. Huston Smith starts this section by stating, chiefly because it permits a plurality of wives, the West has accused Islam of degrading women. But the focus of this section starts with a comparison of the status of women before Muhammad and then the status of women after Muhammad. So that will be our chief focus and how we take on this section. Specifically, how the ideologies within the Quran improved the status of women. So before Muhammad, also known as the days of ignorance, marriage arrangements were so loose as to be scarcely recognizable. And according to Huston Smith, women were regarded as little more than cattle, and daughters had no inheritance. So the Quran forbade infanticide. Also, the Quran made sure to include daughters in inheritance, not equally, but daughters were to receive half the portions of sons. But according to Huston Smith, the greatest contribution to the status of women from the Quran was the institution of marriage. The Quran accomplished this first by sanctifying marriage, by making it the sole lawful locus of sexual acts. So the Quran strengthened the bond between marriage and sex. Secondly, the Quran requires that women give her free consent before she may be wed. Not even a sultan may marry without his bride's express approval. Third, Islam tightened the wedding bond itself enormously. While Muhammad did not forbid divorce, it was viewed only as a last resort, for nothing displeased God more than the disruption of marital vows. However, even though the Quran strengthened the sanctity of marriage, there is still an issue here that must be addressed: the issue of polygamy. It is true, the Quran permits up to 4 wives simultaneously. However, it does set limitations. It explicitly states, if you cannot deal equitably and justly with more than one wife, you shall marry only one. And equality here doesn't just refer to the material, but love and esteem as well. Each wife must have private quarters and equal love and esteem. This provision has led jurists to argue that the Quran virtually enjoins monogamy. And what Huston Smith means here is that it seems to urge monogamy, for it's almost impossible to distribute affection and regard with exact equality. And this interpretation has been in the Muslim picture since the 3rd century. Thus, multiple wives are seldom found in Islam today. Almost as if he can hear our objections, Huston Smith does go back to the idea, though, that Quran does permit polygamy. You may marry 2, 3, or 4 wives, but no more. The Muslims insist, however, that this shows Islam's versatility and starts off with polygamy being the moral preference, which is highlighted by 2 situations. Individually, if a situation arose where early in the marriage the wife were to contract paralysis or another disability that would prevent sexual union, the alternative to polygamy, which is monogamy, isn't the moral preference in this situation. And another situation, collectively, imagine a war that decimates the male population, would force an option between polygamy and depriving a large portion of women of motherhood and a nuclear family of any sort. These issues are meant to highlight the idea that polygamy offers a kind of versatility that monogamy does not. Overall, however, the law of Islam sets down a polygamous framework that provides a modicum of control. It does not allow the sensuality of the male to basically run riot, obeying nothing but his own impulses. From here, Huston Smith highlights a section within Islamic law. For as he states, impression is widespread that law is excessively harsh. He names 3, the Jewish law of death by stoning, the severing of a thief's hand, and flogging for a number of offenses. What's important in this section is the idea of mercy by averting penalties by doubt that Muhammad told his people. So one can avert guilt by arguing or instilling doubt. As such, adultery is very difficult to prove, because of the proviso, that 4 unimpeachable witnesses must have observed the act in detail. Hardly an easy task. Flogging can also be fulfilled by a light sandal, and a thief may retain their hands if the thief was in genuine need. A thief who steals a loaf of bread in order to feed his or her starving family would not receive this form of punishment. Thus, Huston Smith took some time here to clear up some common misconceptions about Islamic law, polygamy, and the status of women. And thus, we will move on to a third area that was improved by the Quran, race relations. Now, in the section of race relations, it's really interesting how it's intertwined with the 5th pillar of Islam, or the pilgrimage. It starts out that racial equality has achieved a remarkable degree of interracial coexistence. So if you think about this 5th pillar of Islam, it stressed equality by insisting that those of the Islamic faith must, when they are able, journey to Mecca. And this journey would show at its foundation a unity of ideas, something that went beyond race or nationality. So you can see how the Quran improved race relations. Even Abraham was a model of racial equality because he married Hajar, a black woman who the Muslims regarded as a second wife and not a concubine. Malcolm X also made his 1964 pilgrimage to Mecca and discovered that racism had no precedent in Islam and could not be accommodated to it. Not only is racial equality inherent in one of the pillars, it is actually one of the overarching reasons for the pilgrimage. And finally, we come to the 4th area in which the Quran improved, the use of force. As stated in the other lecture, the Muslims were conquerors. Thus, there's a stereotype of Muslims as a man with a sword outstretched, followed by a long train of wives. The Quran, to make clear here, does not counsel turning the other cheek or pacifism. It teaches forgiveness and the return of good for evil when the circumstances warrant. Turn away evil with that which is better. Quran 42:37. Nevertheless, the Quran allows punishment of wanton wrongdoers to the full extent of the injury they impact. Quran 22:39 through 40. However, Muhammad did leave many traditions regarding the decent conduct of war. For example, agreements are to be honored and treachery avoided. Women and children and the old are to be spared, as are orchards, crops, and sacred objects. If you think about it, this comes from the whole circulatory model here and the understanding that individuals will not be able to maintain order or think higher, more intellectually, until their physiological needs are met. Thus, don't burn down their crops and food and leave them starving. All of this, however, comes from the definition of a righteous war that must be either defensive or to right a wrong. You can defend yourselves against your enemies, but do not attack them first, for God hates an aggressor. Quran 2:190. Thus, when referring back to the story of Muhammad, in the face of unrelenting hostility from Mecca and the possibility of his God-entrusted faith being wiped from earth, Muhammad could not go the martyr path. He had to choose to take up the sword, for what he was entrusted with would right the wrongs of the days of ignorance and improve the life of his people. So Muhammad, having seized the sword in self-defense, he held on to it to the end. This much Muslims acknowledge, but they insist that while Islam has at times spread by the sword, it has mostly spread by persuasion and example. If you think about the followers that flocked from Medina to hear Muhammad's tale, in the face of the persecution that was going on in Mecca, that gives a great example here of the spread by persuasion and example as opposed to the sword. Philosophically here, however, we have a just war theory, one that is ingrained in the Quran, and that is the fact that a just war must be either defensive or right a wrong. In the last part of the social teachings, Huston Smith outlines what Muslims like to point out and what they like to deny. First of all, Muslims like to point out that Muhammad incorporated into his character for Medina the principle of religious tolerance. For example, Jews who attached themselves to the Commonwealth, and later on Christians, shall be protected from all insults and vexations. They shall have an equal right with our own people to our assistance and good offices. Even conquered nations were permitted freedom of worship contingent only on the payment of a special tax in lieu of the poor due, from which they were exempt. This stems from the ideology from Muhammad that states, "Will you then force men to believe when belief can come only from God?" That is to say that you cannot force belief on an individual. Belief can only come from God. Have Muslims lived up to this ideal? Huston Smith states that it's too complex of a question to answer within such a narrow framework of this chapter. He does state that on the positive side, Muslims point to the long centuries during which in India, Spain, and the Near East, Christian, Jews, and Hindus lived quietly and in freedom under Muslim rule. However, Muslims do admit that their own record of respecting force is not exemplary. But there are 3 points that Muslims deny. First, they do deny that Islam's record of intolerance and aggression is greater than the rest of any other major religion, an exception being made here possibly for Buddhism. Second, they deny that the Western histories are fair to Islam in their account of its use of force. Case in point, they list some common misconceptions. A, that jihad literally means exertion, though because war requires exertion in exceptional degree, the word jihad is often attached to war. B, the definition of a holy war in Islam is virtually identical with that of a just war in Christianity, whereto it is often referred to as a holy war. C, Christianity too considers that those who die in such wars to be martyrs and promises them salvation. D, the hadith, canonical sayings of Muhammad, ranks the battle against evil within one's heart above the battle against external enemies, which is where we turn to the conception of jihad, because there is a lesser meaning and a greater meaning to jihad. The lesser meaning within jihad is a battle against external enemies, probably closest to the understanding that most Westerners have of jihad. But there is a greater meaning in jihad, the battle with the enemy within. This is not only the greater battle, it is the battle that ranks higher than all other forms of external battles, according to Muhammad. An understanding that warrants the correlation, for often it is the lesser meaning that gets the highlights. But the third fact that Muslims deny is that the blots in their record should be charged against their religion, whose presiding ideal they affirm in their standard greeting, "Peace be upon you." The rest of this lecture is going to be dedicated to a specific division within Islam called Sufism. a section I hope not to spend too much time on because most of the important philosophical distinctions and theories were presented already. But thus far, we have been speaking about Islam as if it's a united religion. However, much like other religious traditions, it does divide. Now, there's a division between the mainstream Sunnis, which are traditionalists from Sunnah, and make up 87% of all Muslims. And then there's the Shiites, literally partisans of Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, who they believe should have directly succeeded Muhammad, but was 3 times passed over and then assassinated once appointed leader. Now, geographically, the Shiites cluster around Iraq and Iran, while the Sunnis flank them to the west in the Middle East, Turkey, and Africa. But instead of focusing on these distinctions, Huston Smith chooses to focus on in-house disputes between the faith itself. And in-house disputes come from the mystics of Islam, the Sufis, and the majority of the faith who are equally good Muslims but are not mystics. Therefore, the remainder of this section is going to talk about the mystical approach to Islam that is highlighted in Sufism. Sufi's root meaning is wool or suf. And those within the Islamic community who bore the inner message of Islam, this mystical meaning, donned coarse woolen garments to protest the silks and satins of the sultans and caliphs. Overall, the Sufis sought to purify and spiritualize from within, wanting to recover Islam's liberty and love and restore it to its deeper meaning. As a result, they believed that the externals yield to internals. Matter yields to meaning. The outward symbol yields to the inner reality. They state, love the picture less and the water more. Which brings us to the distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric Muslims. This distinction came from the Quran itself, where Allah presented himself as the outward, al-Zahir, and the inward, al-Batin, 57:3. Yet not many Muslims have the time, if the inclination, to do more than keep up with the divine law that orders their life. Sufis, however, were impatient for their reward and wanted to encounter God directly in this very lifetime. So the Sufis gathered around spiritual masters, which crystallized into a Sufi order, which constituted the spiritual elite likened to the orders of the Roman Catholic Church. Overall, however, the Sufis believed that they could reach God directly. Now, someone who is ignorant of fire, for example, can come to know fire in 3 degrees. The first degree by hearing it, the second degree by seeing it, and finally being burnt by it. So the Sufis wanted to know God in this 3rd sense. The Sufis wanted to be burned by God, which is to say they wanted to experience God here on earth. So in order to know God directly, that would require them drawing closer to him. And they developed 3 overlapping but distinguishable routes in order to get closer to God. And that is of love, ecstasy, and of intuition. Now, the route of love is where you find the Sufi love poetry that is world famous. And one such creator of this world famous poetry comes from an 8th century woman saint named Rabia, who believed love is never more evident than when its object is absent. We understand this kind of ideology in the parable, absence makes the heart grow fonder. But from the aspect of love drawn closer to God, the pangs of separation tend to deepen one's love of God and therefore draw them closer to him. Another world-famous poet comes from Rumi, and Huston Smith places his poetry about the reed flute on the bottom of 359. However, the lament of the flute, torn from its riverbank, is a symbol for the soul's severance from the divine, and thus threw Sufis into a state of agitation and bewilderment. Yet Rumi asserts that human love is returned. Never does the lover seek without being sought by his beloved. When the lightning of love has shot into this heart, know that there is love in that heart. Mark well the text. He loves them and they love him. The final text coming from Quran 5:59. But according to Huston Smith, the full truth has still not been grasped, for Allah loves his creatures more than they love him. Yet overall, this aspect of Sufism that focuses on love in poetry is meant to draw you closer, not only by eliciting that love for the divine, but having that understanding that the pangs of separation are going to hurt. Yet that separation has a way of drawing you closer. For Huston Smith, he is calling the second Sufi approach to the divine presence ecstatic, which literally means to stand outside oneself, because it turns on experiences that differ, not just in degree, but in kind from the usual ones. And often the presiding metaphor for the ecstatic Sufis was the prophet's night journey through the seven heavens into the divine presence. However, that does not mean that the Sufis believed they would come to see exactly what Muhammad saw that night. Rather, they wanted to move in the direction towards the possibility of experiencing the divine. And this is accomplished by dissociating from oneself, losing consciousness of the world as it's normally perceived. Through this experience, they infuse grace. As Sufis report that as their consciousness begins to change, it feels as if their wills were placed in abeyance and a superior will takes over. Which leads us to the third route that Sufis use in order to get closer to God. Now, like the other two, this third way of getting closer to God does bring knowledge, but of a distinct sort. For love mysticism yields heart knowledge, and the ecstasy mysticism yields visual or visionary knowledge. But intuitive mysticism brings mental knowledge. Now, this intuitional knowledge comes from a prevailing philosophy that the world's objects are garments that God dons to create a world. And these garments can become progressively more transparent as the eye of the heart gains its strength. So the ability to see through the material world to that God in disguise is obtained through the eye of the heart. In order to penetrate this disguise that God dons is through symbolism. In using visual objects to speak of invisible things, symbolism is the language of religion as numbers are to science. Al-Ghazali defines symbols as the science of relations between multiple levels of reality. One example of this is Lao Tzu and the yin and yang. Now, Lao Tzu believed that deep concentration and contemplation on the yin and yang symbol will yield all the mysteries of the world. So here we have a symbol in which long forms of concentration will allow you to penetrate that symbol and find the secrets within. For the Sufis, a lot of the Quran has these hidden verses of symbolism within it. For example, removing one's shoes when entering a mosque means that you're trying to remove what separates your soul from God. And even in a deeper sense, could be a form of asking forgiveness or to be forgiven for one's separate existence. So now that that is clarified, we can go into some of the issues other Muslims have with Sufism. One is, it was incomprehensible to Muslims that Rabi'ah's teachings insisted that one's existence is a sin with which no other can be compared. As discussed before, Islam doesn't have this idea of original sin because God is good and God created you to be good. So that's one thing that is incomprehensible to the exoteric Muslims. Another issue is specifically with Al-Hallaj's assertion that he was God, which exoteric Muslims would see as outright blasphemy, because it goes against the very nature is there is no other God but the God. And since symbolism is the main way of the intuitional path in order to define God, one issue here is it is open to interpretation. Sufis often claim, if only by implication, an authority derived directly from God and a knowledge gained from above rather than learned in schools. With that aside, however, still on the whole, the esoteric and the exoteric have achieved a healthy balance in Islam. For long periods since Muhammad called his people to God's oneness, Muslims have wandered from the spirit of the Prophet. Their leaders are the first to admit that practice has often been replaced by mere profession, and that fervor has waned. However, it is important to note that during Europe's Dark Ages, Muslim philosophers and scientists kept the lamp of learning bright, ready to spark the Western mind when it roused from its long sleep. However, as Huston Smith puts quite bluntly, Islam is emerging from several centuries of stagnation, which colonization no doubt exacerbated, and now faces enormous problems. How to distinguish industrial modernization, which on balance it welcomes, from westernization, which on balance it does not. And with that, we have reached the end of the second lecture on Islam. The next lesson will be a review week, so make sure you finish your discussion board and the quiz for this lesson. Have a great day.